Tragic Justice, the story of Rev. Clint Dobson, Judy Elliott, and Steven Nelson. In March 2011, an unspeakable tragedy unfolded at NorthPointe Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. What began as an ordinary day spiraled into devastating violence, leaving one man dead and another woman severely injured. Rev. Clint Dobson, a 38-year-old pastor loved for his warm spirit and community work, was smothered to death during a robbery that went horribly wrong. Meanwhile, Judy Elliott, a 64-year-old church administrator, was brutally beaten and left for dead. This harrowing incident shook not only the Arlington community, but also countless others who followed the case. At the center of it stood Steven Nelson, a man whose actions raised profound questions about justice, morality, and consequences. As we unravel the events leading up to this crime, its aftermath, and the controversial death penalty sentence handed to Nelson, we aim to honor the lives affected and shed light on deeper systemic issues. On that fateful day in 2011, NorthPointe Baptist Church, a sanctuary of peace, became the setting of unimaginable horror. Steven Nelson, then 24 years old, entered the church with robbery on his mind. Rev. Clint Dobson and Judy Elliott, engaged in their daily routines, had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. What followed was a botched robbery that turned deadly. Nelson smothered Rev. Dobson, a pastor whose life was defined by serving others to death. Judy Elliott was attacked and beaten viciously, but against all odds, she survived. The details of that day paint a haunting picture, the sanctity of a house of worship desecrated by violence and loss. Nelson later claimed he was merely a lookout, insisting that two unknown accomplices carried out the attack. Regardless, the evidence at the scene and witness testimonies pointed heavily toward his direct involvement. His actions unveiled an unsettling lack of remorse. Bystanders later recounted how he laughed at news coverage of the incident and casually used stolen items from the crime in his daily life. This brazen behavior further inflamed the community's grief and anger. Who was Steven Nelson, and what led him to commit such a heinous act? Raised in challenging circumstances fraught with abuse and instability, Nelson's life trajectory seemed destined for hardship. These early experiences undoubtedly shaped the man he became, but could they justify his actions on that day in 2011? Despite his claims of being a secondary player in the crime, authorities and the judicial system saw otherwise. Witnesses recounted his cold detachment and his involvement in the robbery and murder. As lawyers and prosecutors pieced together the timeline, it became clear that Steven Nelson bore responsibility for the horror that unfolded. But questions lingered. Who were the two accomplices Nelson alleged were involved? Why were they never brought to justice? The wheels of justice quickly turned after Nelson's arrest. In 2012, he was tried for capital murder, a charge that carried the most severe consequence under Texas law. Throughout the trial, Nelson's defense argued mitigating factors, including his deeply troubled upbringing. However, the prosecution painted a different picture, a man who showed no remorse, a person who willingly destroyed lives for personal gain. The jury ultimately handed down a conviction for capital murder, and Steven Nelson was sentenced to death. This decision marked a critical juncture in the story, where justice, fairness, and moral accountability collided. For many in the community, the verdict felt like closure. For others, it sparked discomfort with the idea of capital punishment, even for such a brutal crime. While the legal proceedings focused on Steven Nelson, the human toll of his actions extended far beyond the courtroom. Judy Elliott, despite surviving the brutal attack, endured profound physical and emotional scars. Her strength in the aftermath of the incident was nothing short of inspiring. Yet the trauma of that day cast a long shadow over her remaining years. Tragically, Elliott passed away in 2024, leaving behind a legacy of resilience and determination. For Rev. Clint Dobson, life ended far too soon. Known for his kindness and dedication to community service, his death left a void that could never be filled. To honor his life and work, the Clint Dobson Memorial Award was established, celebrating excellence in community service. Through this annual recognition, his inspiring story continues to touch lives, even in the wake of such unspeakable loss. The congregation at NorthPointe Baptist Church also bore the burden of this tragedy, grappling with the realities of fear, anger, and grief. The events of that day forced the church to redefine itself while clinging to its faith. In February 2025, Stephen LaWayne Nelson is scheduled to die by lethal injection, marking the end of a painful saga. But as the execution looms, it stirs passionate debates, particularly within Christian communities. On one side are those who feel justice is finally being served. They argue that for the severity of Nelson's crimes, the ultimate punishment is warranted. On the other side, opponents of the death penalty question this approach, suggesting that forgiveness, one of Christianity's core principles, should guide responses to tragedy. Jeff Hood, Nelson's spiritual advisor and a staunch anti-death penalty advocate, has been vocal about seeking clemency for Nelson. Hood raises broader ethical questions surrounding capital punishment, noting the systemic flaws in pursuing justice through such irreversible means. For Hood, the cycle of violence must end somewhere, or it will only perpetuate itself. Hood's appeals for clemency extend beyond legal arguments. He highlights Stephen Nelson's tumultuous background, including the abuse and neglect he suffered as a child. For Hood, Nelson's life circumstances, while not excusing his actions, provide a context that warrants mercy rather than execution. Hood has also reached out to the parent church of NorthPointe Baptist to support his clemency campaign. However, these appeals have been met with silence. The church's reluctance to take a stance reflects the complexities of this case, where justice and forgiveness collide in deeply personal ways. For many, the question remains, is ending Stephen Nelson's life an act of justice or yet another tragedy born of violence? Beyond this specific case lies a broader conversation about the justice system, systemic inequities, and the way society responds to violent crime. Cases like this expose cracks in the system, highlighting how deeply intertwined justice and social factors are. Themes of redemption and accountability take center stage in such debates. Can someone like Stephen Nelson, who inflicted so much harm, find redemption? And how does society balance the need for punishment with the possibility of rehabilitation? For many, the tragedy of NorthPointe Baptist Church is a microcosm of larger issues: cycles of abuse, systemic failures in addressing early warning signs, and the morality of the death penalty itself. The story of Rev. Clint Dobson, Judy Elliott, and Stephen Nelson is one steeped in tragedy, pain, and unanswered questions. At its heart are the lives that were irreparably shattered by a senseless act of violence, as well as the lingering impact on a community and legal system grappling with themes of justice and redemption. As Stephen Nelson approaches execution, the case continues to spur passionate discussions about morality, fairness, and societal responsibility. It is a reminder of the human cost of violent crime, not only for the victims and their families, but also for the perpetrators. By reflecting on this story, we hope to honor the lives lost and affected while encouraging a deeper conversation about forgiveness, justice, and the systemic changes needed to prevent tragedies like this from happening again.